Have you ever stopped to consider, like, the bedrock of your freedom? That invisible shield protecting you from being locked away without just cause?
Yeah, it sounds dramatic, but it's a very real thing.
It really is. And that's what we're diving into today, habeas corpus.
Exactly. It's Latin, you shall have the body. Sounds a bit old-fashioned, maybe.
A little bit.
But the idea behind it, well, it's absolutely central to individual liberty. It's the right to challenge why you're being held.
And that's really our mission today. We've looked at, historical stuff, legal analysis, even some pieces looking ahead to really get a handle on this right. Especially now with figures like Stephen Miller publicly talking about maybe suspending it.
Right, that definitely brought it back into the conversation.
So our goal is to give you a clear picture of habeas corpus, its history, where it stands, what the limits are, and what it really means when people talk about setting it aside without, getting totally lost in legal jargon.
And Miller's comments, particularly around immigration and border security, they really show why this ancient legal tool is still so incredibly relevant today.
Okay, so let's get right to the core of it. In plain terms, what is habeas corpus?
Okay, simply put, if you're detained by the government, habeas corpus is your right to go before a judge and make the government prove that your detention is actually lawful.
So it's a check on power.
It's the ultimate check, really, on states' power to just hold you indefinitely. It's your legal pathway to ask, is this legitimate if you think you're being held unfairly?
That makes a lot of sense. So where did this idea even come from? It feels pretty fundamental, like challenging raw authority.
Oh, roots go way, way back. Most people point to the Magna Carta in 1215.
Magna Carta.
The idea then, which was pretty groundbreaking, was that even the king couldn't just throw someone in prison on a whim.
A huge shift.
Absolutely. A foundational principle against that kind of unchecked rule. Then, over centuries, this evolved in English common law. By the 17th century, it became a much more solid legal procedure to fight unlawful imprisonment.
And this wasn't just an English thing that stayed over there, right? The U.S. founders, they clearly thought it was important.
Oh, definitely. This right, which was hard-won in England, became a cornerstone for them. They put it right into Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution.
Article 1, Section 9. Not even the Bill of Rights.
Exactly. The fact it's in the main body really shows how crucial they thought it was. A fundamental safeguard against government overreach right from the start.
And the Constitution also spells out when this right can be suspended. That's the tricky part that always comes up. What's the wording there?
Right. The key phrase is, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it.
Okay, rebellion or invasion.
Notice how specific that is. And extreme. Rebellion. Invasion. It suggests it really meant only for the most serious, exceptional national emergencies.
Yeah, that paints a pretty intense picture. So habeas corpus isn't just for typical criminal cases then. It seems like it applies more broadly.
That's right. Think about someone arrested for a crime. Habeas corpus lets them go to court and say, wait, do you actually have the legal grounds to keep me locked up? But yeah, it goes beyond that. It's also really important in immigration law. It allows people facing deportation, for instance, to challenge whether their detention is lawful.
Even while their case is processed.
Yes, and even someone already in prison can use it, maybe to argue that their basic rights are being violated while they're incarcerated. It's quite versatile.
Okay, let's pivot to the present day then, and Stephen Miller's statement about possibly suspending habeas corpus. What was the sort of context for that?
Well, Miller's comments came up during the Trump administration, which had a very strong focus on immigration enforcement and border security policies.
Right.
The thinking, it seemed, was that suspending habeas corpus could speed up the detention and removal process for undocumented immigrants or people seen as potential security threats.
So the idea was basically to cut through the usual legal steps to make detention faster?
That seems to be the rationale presented, yes. The argument, presumably, was that for national security or border control, these quicker, less reviewed processes were needed.
Okay, but how did legal experts take that kind of talk? I can't imagine that sat well.
No, you're right. By and large, legal experts reacted with pretty deep concern. They saw it as a potentially serious threat to basic civil liberties and, the constitutional structure itself.
A dangerous precedent.
Exactly. The worry was setting a precedent where bypassing these fundamental legal checks becomes sort of normalized or seen as acceptable in certain contexts.
Were there political angles to this, too, beyond the purely legal arguments?
Oh, absolutely. Political analysts pointed out that, well, floating the idea of suspending habeas corpus could be a way to energize a political base worried about immigration.
Like a rallying cry.
Potentially. It's strong rhetoric. It can create a sense of crisis and make extreme measures seem more justifiable, at least to some audiences.
And what about groups like the ACLU, the civil liberties organizations? What did they say?
They were very outspoken in their opposition. They warned that any attempt to actually suspend habeas corpus would face immediate and serious legal challenges. They stressed it would just fundamentally contradict core principles of due process.
Right, and this whole debate, it has deep historical roots, doesn't it? We touched on Magna Carta, but can we dig a bit more into how the legal framework developed specifically in the U.S.?
Sure. So as we said, the principle comes from Magna Carta, gets solidified in English law by the 1600s. It was a right people really fought for over a long time.
And then the U.S. Constitution adopted it. How has the Supreme Court shaped our understanding of it since then? Any really key cases we should know about?
Yeah, a couple of landmark cases really stand out. First, there's Ex parte Milligan from 1866, right after the Civil War.
Milligan.
This case established a really crucial limit. It said the military can't try civilians in military courts if the regular civilian courts are open and functioning, even in wartime.
So keeping military power in check regarding civilians.
Exactly. It drew a firm line protecting against martial law creeping into civilian life when the normal courts are still working. A big deal for limiting government power, especially executive power during conflict.
That seems vital. What about something more recent?
Well, the 2008 case, Boumediene v. Bush, is incredibly important too.
Boumediene. That involved Guantanamo Bay, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It dealt with the habeas corpus rights of detainees held at Guantanamo. The Supreme Court ruled that these detainees, even though held outside formal U.S. territory, did have a constitutional right to habeas corpus.
Wow, so the right isn't just tied to geography.
That was the key takeaway. The court emphasized that it protects fundamental human liberties, and its reach isn't strictly limited by where someone happens to be detained by the U.S. government.
That's a powerful statement about the scope of the right. Now, let's circle back to who actually has the power to suspend it. You mentioned Article 1. Section 9 points to Congress, not the president alone. Can you elaborate on that framework?
Yes, that's critical. The Constitution explicitly gives the power to suspend habeas corpus to Congress, the legislative branch, not the executive branch, the president.
Separation of powers.
Precisely. It's a fundamental part of that balance. And again, only under those very specific extreme conditions, rebellion or invasion, where public safety genuinely requires it.
Has Congress actually been involved in suspensions historically?
Yes. The main example is the Civil War. President Lincoln initially suspended habeas corpus in certain areas on his own authority, which was controversial.
Right.
But then, in 1863, Congress passed a law, the Habeas Corpus Act of 1863, that essentially gave retroactive authorization and set some rules for the suspension. This really underscores that Congress is meant to be involved in such a significant decision.
So a congressional action followed the executive action there.
It did. And, discussions came up again after 9/11 regarding suspected terrorists. Habeas corpus wasn't formally suspended then, but laws like the USA Patriot Act did expand government surveillance and detention powers. That sparked intense debate about balancing security and liberty, a debate that always comes up when we talk about exceptions to fundamental rights.
Okay, so the power exists constitutionally, but it's limited, rests with Congress, and is tied to extreme emergencies. What are the real-world consequences we might face if habeas corpus were suspended, even if supposedly meeting those conditions?
Well, the consequences could be profound. The most obvious one is the erosion of civil liberties. People could potentially be detained indefinitely, without trial, without any way to challenge their detention in court.
So just held.
Just held. It opens the door to massive government overreach, wrongful imprisonment, potentially on a large scale. I mean, imagine being detained with zero legal recourse. That's the stark reality it presents.
That's genuinely chilling. Removing that basic check.
Exactly. And think about the chilling effect it could have on free speech, on dissent. If people fear being locked up without recourse, would they speak out?
Yeah.
Would they protest? Maybe not.
Right. It could silence opposition.
It could. Plus, it would fundamentally disrupt the whole judicial system, our basic ideas of justice. It could drastically shift the balance of power towards the executive branch. And there's always the risk of abuse using that power to target specific groups, perhaps marginalized communities.
If a suspension were actually attempted today, what kind of reaction would we likely see, legally and from the public?
Oh, you'd almost certainly see a huge public outcry. History shows people mobilize when core civil liberties feel threatened. You'd expect widespread protests, intense media coverage, and very strong advocacy from civil rights groups.
And the courts would get involved immediately, presumably.
Absolutely. Organizations like the ACLU would file major lawsuits almost instantly, arguing the suspension was unconstitutional, either because the conditions weren't met or because the action itself violated fundamental rights.
So a massive legal battle.
Definitely. The judiciary, all the way up to the Supreme Court potentially, would have the crucial role of reviewing whether the suspension was legal. And public pressure, combined with these legal challenges, has historically influenced how governments act in these situations.
It's useful to remember this isn't just a U.S. issue, this tension between security and rights. How have other countries handled habeas corpus or similar rights in crises? Does that offer any perspective?
Yeah, looking internationally gives some valuable, sometimes sobering context. For instance, countries like Egypt and Turkey at various points have suspended habeas corpus or similar rights, often justifying it with national security concerns, like after coup attempts.
And the result?
Often this led to mass detentions, people held for long periods without trial, raising serious human rights alarms. It kind of serves as a warning about how quickly things can slide when those protections are removed.
So the security justification can mask a broader crackdown.
That's often the concern, yes. And look at the UK, too. Their anti-terrorism laws have, at times, allowed for prolonged detention without charge. It highlights that constant push and pull, that balancing act between keeping people safe collectively and protecting individual rights, especially when threats feel imminent.
These international examples really drive home how fragile these safeguards can be.
They do. They underscore the potential dangers to democratic norms and basic human rights when fundamental legal protections like habeas corpus are weakened or bypassed.
It really makes you appreciate that habeas corpus is way more than just some dusty legal term. It feels like a living, breathing protection for everyone.
It truly is. It's a cornerstone, And its importance goes far beyond history books. Think about current debates, detention policies, how immigrants are treated, the right to protest. They all connect back to the fundamental principles habeas corpus stands for.
And looking forward, it seems clear that the future of habeas corpus in the U.S., how it's viewed and applied, will keep being shaped by politics, by public opinion, by current events.
Absolutely. The value we collectively place on individual rights versus state power, that's what will ultimately determine how strong this protection remains.
So for everyone listening, maybe think about this. What does it actually mean for you if this right, the right to challenge your own detention, is questioned or threatened? How can you stay informed and, engaged in protecting these liberties that are so basic to our system?
And maybe the ultimate question to ponder is, what's our responsibility as citizens who know about this now to understand these rights and maybe even advocate for them, not just for ourselves today, but to make sure we pass on a society that really values justice and due process for the future?
Those are definitely powerful questions to sit with. Okay, just to quickly recap our deep dive today, we looked at the meaning and the long history of habeas corpus, from Magna Carta to the U.S. Constitution.
We talked about the recent discussions around potentially suspending it, sparked by figures like Stephen Miller and the context of those remarks.
Right, and the crucial legal limits on who can suspend it at Congress, and when only in rebellion or invasion. Very specific conditions.
We explored the pretty serious potential consequences if it were suspended, the impact on civil liberties, the justice system, the risk of abuse.
And we touched on the likely public and legal reactions, plus how other countries have sometimes handled similar rights, often as a cautionary tale.
We really hope this conversation has given you a clearer, deeper understanding of what habeas corpus is all about and why it still matters so much today.
Yeah, we encourage you to take this information, think about it, maybe see how it shapes your view on individual rights and government power. Perhaps look up those cases we mentioned, like Milligan or Boumediene, or check out what civil liberties groups are saying.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.